Hey, this is Dan Wagner from the Catholic Courage channel here at YouTube, and also from danwagner.org. And today I want to talk a little bit about what I thought was a really interesting, not only a sermon, but the gospel reading itself at church. And our priest is awesome, and he gave a great sermon. But I did want to talk about the gospel reading. Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. And he goes on to talk about the two people who were in the temple to pray. There's a Pharisee and a tax collector. The Pharisee says, "Oh God, I thank you that I'm not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, pay tithes on my whole income, blah, blah, blah." The tax collector, on the other hand, beats his breast and says, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Jesus said, the latter went away justified. Alright, so how can it be that people are so convinced of their own righteousness and so unconvinced of everybody else's righteousness? In fact, they despise other people. Well, part of it is this psychological need that we have in our society because we're so narcissistic. We live in a narcissistic society, and YouTube may be an example of that. Maybe this video is an example of that to you. You might say, "Oh my gosh, this guy is so narcissistic." Nonetheless, I'm going to continue. So, how can it be? I read a study once that 93% or 97% of people polled believed they were going to heaven. Yet, they believed like only 37% believed that Mother Teresa was going to heaven. So while they live a life of ease, of falling into sin, we know that sin abounds in our society, and Mother Teresa, who we know lives a sacrificial life and lives a life of austerity and purity, she's going to hell. But me, because, you know, I'm so good in my own eyes that I'm going to go to heaven. So that is just ridiculous. But let's talk about that. So we've got two things going on. We've got people calling good evil and evil good, and Scripture is very clear about that. In the last days, people won't settle. They won't put up with sound doctrine. Okay? What they'll do is they'll call evil good and good evil. And we see it in our culture all the time. Look at the homosexual movement. People that promote homosexuality as not only an acceptable lifestyle, but as a good lifestyle. And we know that homosexuality in itself is disordered, and the expression of it is actually sinful. It actually is an abomination to God. When we take the natural order of things and distort it and look for pleasure and then put that pleasure above God's commandments, that's evil. When we take sex outside of its context, which is procreation, and we cut off any possibility of procreation, I'm talking to you people who contracept as well, you take that and you cut off that ability for sex to be procreative. It's like the person, the teenage girl who shoves her finger down her throat to throw up the meal because she doesn't want that nutrition to happen, because it might make her bones actually have some padding on them. And so what do we call that? We call that an eating disorder. And likewise, we have sexual disorders. When we want to take away, we want to separate the procreative act, which is sex, with the result, with any potential of the result. We want all the pleasure, and we don't want any of the consequences. And that's what we have in our society. And that the hallmark of that, the greatest expression of that in our society, is homosexuality, because a man and a man together cannot procreate. They cannot procreate. We also see it in contraception. We will contracept. We want the sexual experience. We want the oneness, but we don't want our oneness to actually create any human life. We don't want any life to come from our love. So even that act itself is gravely immoral, as is the sexual act, that can't create life. It's lifeless love. So they're both lifeless love. One of them's by nature, and one of them's by the act. You're putting a barricade, as it were, up against the life-giving act. You're contracepting. You're against conception. That's what the contracept means. So, nonetheless, we don't want to do that, and yet, we say it's good. We say it's good. In fact, I love the idea that in the old days we used to call stores dry goods stores, and we still call them sporting goods stores. And we have grocery, which is other kinds of goods, grocery goods. And those kind of good stores, we call them goods. Why? Because they're good. God made them for our pleasure, and pleasure is a good because it's a perceived good. Now, that's not to say all pleasure is good, because what happens is we can take that good and we say, I want that good, and I want it the way I want it. In fact, I'm going to sap every potential pleasure out of it, even if it distorts the good and makes that good actually an abomination to God. God says, hey, I'm going to create this good. He did it in the garden. You can eat of any of the fruit in the garden, and don't touch that. What do we do? Well, God said I shouldn't do it. Let's do it. Let's take it. Let's eat it. So that is in itself the perversion of good, the twisting of good. And of course, when Adam and Eve sinned, what it did is it took our ability to know good and to want good, and it twisted it. It's like a piece of metal that's twisted, and now it just doesn't fit anymore. It doesn't do things right. It doesn't serve its purpose. And that's what original sin is. It's a distortion of the good that God created us, because God created us in His image and likeness. And I don't care who you are. You are made in the image and likeness of God by virtue of your Creator's intent. God gave you intellect, and He gave you will. Intellect and will, the ability to use our mind, to direct our mind towards some good. That's our will. So those two things, those are the reasons God created us. So where does that leave us? So if you're living in a plan, in a lifestyle that's opposed to God's will, we call that sin. Sin is living a life in opposition to God's will. What's God's will? Well, we have the Ten Commandments. That's basically the moral law, and most of it doesn't even need to be, it's not revealed. It's revealed, but it's not revealed divinely. It's revealed through nature. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, or your neighbor's property. And then there's these first three commandments. You shall not worship other gods. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall keep the Lord's day holy. Okay, so those things are directed towards God, because God, it's just that we give God His due. Okay, that's what justice is giving every person their due. Everybody gets their due, and that justice for God is to give Him His due. And He gets to ask because He created it. Okay, so anyhow, I gotta wrap it up. Coming up to that 10-minute mark that YouTube lays on me. And so what's the point? The point is that let's not take evil and call it good. If we're doing something evil, let's not fool ourselves and deceive ourselves and think that we're righteous. In fact, we've all sinned. We've all violated God's commandments. Okay? All have sinned, as it says in Romans, and have fallen short of the glory of God. So let's look at ourselves realistically, realize that we haven't lived up to God's call in our life to be holy, to live the Ten Commandments, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and go turn to God and say, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. This is Dan Wayne from Catholic Courage. Rate this video even if you hate it.